I've got the wrong version of things. Like, hey, good. But when I actually go into display, yep. It's actually not the model. So I've got it's on the wrong way. Yeah, got you. Come out of that.
You can go over
I hate to interfere. Display mode. Why does the moment get the old display mode? Oh, what? Display mode.
I got it, Eric. Yeah. Oh, really? Wow. Hey, you're good to go, Phil? Good. Good.
I haven't Cambridge while Andrew figures out his.
He's going to reboot. He's going to reboot. He needs a Windows computer, not a Mac. There you go.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon again. I just had to reboot as well, so it's not just Andrew heading through. So for this topic, we're switching sort of mode of thinking to some of the softer trust framework issues. And when I spoke to Don and then to Andrew, they said it'd be good if Microsoft could kick off a discussion. And I said, well, I was involved in trust frameworks, it was about 12 years ago. So the one, I just did a little bit of history, my personal perspective, so it's not a comprehensive history of trust frameworks. But I'll start and then hand over to Andrew and Don and to you, and hopefully it's going to be more of a discussion than the sessions we've just been having. So just a number of perspectives. So over 12 years ago, a couple of things happened. One was the EU Digital Electronic Signatures Directive came along from the EC, and that put a requirement on all member states to set up a regulatory framework or body for electronic signature schemes. Richard is smiling at me in the middle of the audience. And so the UK did a UK sort of thing, which was, rather than what a lot of European countries did, which was just hand the job to government, let a government agency run the scheme of certifying who was going to be providing PKI technology or providing PKI type services. What happened in the UK, I think it was primarily the banking and the telco sectors. They lobbied government and said, we don't want heavyweight government regulatory body. We want a lighter weight approach. We want industry self-regulation. So I was aware that the T-Scheme had been set up, and it was populated as a body by banks and telcos. And what we discovered a few years on was that as soon as the government lost interest in PKI, the banks upped and left, if that's Richard is nodding, because all they were after was avoidance of regulation. They weren't necessarily in it to drive what could be achieved with the trust framework. So that was one of the lessons as to how sectors and individuals can drive a particular initiative, which sounds good and it sounds broad, but they're just biding their time and then off they go and leave it high and dry. So in parallel with that sort of thrust of interest from the European Union and on PKI type schemes, the UK government set about its first attempt at putting government online in a strategic way, so led by the Cabinet Office, support from the Treasury in terms of funding, and then trying to get some lead departments to take the initiative and get going and putting services online. So I became involved through happen chance with the Inland Revenue Service, and they said they wanted to put their tax collection services online, both for individuals in terms of self-assessment and PAYE for businesses. So one of the things we learned there was, in order to get things online, we had to break some existing models around how systems integrated did EDI type work. So the thing we did was learn a lesson from some of the industry communities at the time and reach out to software vendors, and I think we had about 50 in the room, so similar size to what we've got today. And we said we need to create some XML schemas for the tax returns, and we're going to do it with you. We're not going to have government tell you what the schemas are. And then we need you to establish trust in those schemas, in the protocol for submitting tax returns, and putting yourselves on the market that will be listed by the Inland Revenue Services. Here's 30 odd vendors you can choose from for doing self-assessment. So the approach was we took the tax return, which is a number of schedules, long documents, split it up literally, and handed it out to different parts of the audience. So row 1 had the first schedule, row 2 had the second schedule. We said, off you go, come back in 3 weeks with the drafts, and we went through that drafting process to agree the standard. And we had to do it in a few months because deadlines were looming. The minister just stood up and rather bravely said, we'll be online come January, and this was the beginning of the autumn, and we didn't have long to do it. So we learned one way of building trust with vendors and getting trusted applications out there at a sort of scale. We then took a similar approach when, in order to step up from just inland revenue doing this, joining up with other government departments, because that was a condition from the Treasury, if you're going to do something, join up with other departments, put a business case together to join that government. So we had to join up with Customs and Excise and spoke to them about putting VAT returns online, and the Ministry of Agriculture about putting the funding for, to farmers in terms of reliefs and subsidies online. And this is where we ran into different government departments have different business drivers, what they want to get out of putting things online. And with respect to trust, what customers were interested in is the ability to prosecute, because they suffer from a lot of VAT fraud, prosecute people who submit something online. Therefore, they were looking for a digital signature, because they had been told they could take a digital signature to court and they could deal with fraud from that basis. So that was sort of the dealing with fraud, which pushed them into digital certificates. For the Ministry of Agriculture, the business driver was, well, we're handing out a lot of money to these farmers. We're doing it under the auspices of the EC. We need to be using the latest and greatest technology. That drove them to looking at certificates. The Inland Revenue said, well, we've got the best part of 10 million self-assessment taxpayers. We want all of them online as soon as possible, and we just want to have the easiest path, friction-free path, get them online. And they were going down the password route. So immediately we had this sort of, yes, we'll work together, but we've got different requirements. Let's launch something. So what we quickly learned was to get registration authority and certificate authority functions out into the rural areas of the UK for use by farmers was a non-starter. That was a lesson that was rapidly learned. Customs saw very low take-up on VAT, so they switched from certificates as their policy requirement to passwords as well. But in the process of sort of teasing out those sort of initiatives, we had to work out a scale approach for trust. So seeing T-Scheme were there and looking at what they currently had in terms of PKI type profiles or standards. So we approached them with what the government was trying to do. And then we worked with some policy people around what is the evidence for identity, for verification of identity. So some policy documents were published around 2002 for the minimum requirements for the verification of identity for individuals, and they did another one for organisations. So we had a thrust of departments with differing requirements. We had the policy on evidence needed with this sort of, the first sort of elucidation of the 4 levels of assurance. And then we sat down with T-Scheme and we said, we liked what we saw there because it's a very open governance model. It's a very lightweight, Richard described it as a golf club. So it's just sort of the experts who are willing to attend committee meetings, for which they get little recompense, to agree the rules from a steering board perspective, a technical working group perspective, to do 3 main things. Let's create a set of profiles that we think make sense. So they refine the existing profiles targeted for PKI. So instead of having a profile for just certificate service providers and certificate technologies, we neutralised it with a new profile to be credential. And so we came up with a new profile for trust service providers who might be, like we're seeing with the post office, verifying the identity of individuals, assigning a level of assurance, and that level of assurance is a combination of the evidence of identity and the sort of degree of strength in the credentialing mechanism. So it's that combination of factors. So I think it was Richard. Is Jim Lowndes still in here? It wasn't it? We sat down and it took the working group a few months to sort of come up with a new set of profiles. And there we were. We had profiles, and then the existing T-Scheme processes for certifying assessors. This was KPMG. The traditional auditors, and they were up for, yes, we can go into an entity and do an audit to see if they're following this particular profile, say yay or nay, and then it's up to T-Scheme to say, do we award a trust mark in terms of brand, that this entity is a trusted brand for verification of identity. So they had a process for certifying assessors, and then the underlying process for how those assessors would certify entities, and it could be any entity from the public or private sector who wanted to offer themselves up as a branded and approved trust service provider. And they could choose whether they wanted to be level 1 or level 4 or somewhere in the middle. So
So that all came about really well, but I think what happened was with T-Scheme, the market went from underneath their feet to a degree, partly because the banks took off, and partly because just the oddity that with inland revenue services, they found that they could become an identity provider for their own service, because they already knew that the 10 million people who were submitting tax returns, those were the people they wanted to target with the advertising and the delivery of the software. And so they learned from the likes, I guess, of Experian and Equifax, this idea of knowledge-based evidence to prove identity. They had the knowledge in their existing systems. All they had to do was surface some of that knowledge, have an online process for matching, providing attributes to match against that. And so they found that they themselves could stand government up as an identity provider to enable individuals to choose a piece of software package to prepare their tax returns and then send that into the relying party, which would consume their tax return. So there was a few things that meant the sort of legs were sort of knocked away from T-Scheme. What really struck me was, as we've done with the industry body on schemas, they had a sort of set of working processes around trust and defining a trust framework. And we had these 4 levels of assurance, and what we didn't know at the time, we hadn't given birth to this concept, how it was going to take off internationally. So I think what I've seen, having spent time in the US and seeing what's been happening since then across the rest of the world, is you keep seeing these levels of assurance idea pop up. So Don, I'm sure you've seen it the last few years across the US, everybody keeps referring to this. So if you go and talk to the aerospace industry body, they talk about the levels of assurance. If you go into health or pharmaceuticals, with all their industry communities, and if you look under the covers, then quite often you find the same 4 levels of assurance. And then what struck me just more recently was the talk of the tension that's between levels 2 and 3, and this goes back to, we saw this right from the early days, partly because of these different government departments and their requirements. So level 2 and level 3, level 2 does some confidence of who you are, level 3 is high confidence, level 2 on credentials is password, level 3 was digital certificates, and you have this sort of a body of industry and other stakeholders in government thinking there was a maturity model. People would have progressed rapidly to levels 3 and 4 because that was the silver or the golden bullet, and that created the sort of drive for the momentum. And I think what we're just learning from some of the sessions today is it's almost impossible to expect a trust framework to determine what will work. You have to reach out to this sort of community and hear the sort of inputs you're seeing today. And it's much better if incrementally industry says, well, I like what Microsoft done or what Google or what Yahoo has done. I can use that. I can work with my competitor with what Google's done around their account choose or whatever. And you see trust and adoption and the user experience, all those sort of factors I think we were hearing about today. That was teased out far more quickly and far more sensibly and pragmatically by having these community arrangements than by expecting some supposedly body of experts in a trust framework can actually do this magically and then certify and then say how it's going to be certified and done. So I think that was one of the observations historically, and I think it's true today, just from what I was hearing. Andrew, are you ready to go? I'm going to beg for 2 more minutes. So that was my historical perspective. Jumping ahead, so I indicated I was involved in various projects actually trying to deliver services as well as working on some of the enabling technology. So I thought I'd mention one of the things that we're working on at the moment, and it's the problem around health and social care, and how what the government is trying to do is recognise it hasn't got the capacity or the means to serve people in need of health and social care. So what they're looking is to grow capacity in the private sector and to use technology and cloud services and all the good things that you've been hearing about to build up the capacity to help people. And I think that session by Patrick on social networks was quite interesting. So this is one of the diagrams that we've been talking to. And it's the idea of building a personal network for a particular purpose. And the purpose is a care network. And the scenario could be with the picture of the baby in the middle, is the mum has just had a baby and she wants to be able to not only share pictures of the baby with her close family and friends in the initial circle, but she may want to share the development of that child, not only the fun side, but also the health side. And if anything goes wrong, to be able to bring in experts, which could be in the family or from volunteers, as well as from the statutory agencies. So what we're about is the ability to build a personal network for a particular purpose, like a care network, where you pull in people in layers. It may start with your friends and family, and using Facebook consent mechanisms, and reaching out to other social ID providers. Working with social enterprise. If you look at what's happening in the social care space, there's a lot of initiatives by both individuals but also significant entities to run up services and to provide those. So we want to be inclusive of the voluntary sector, social enterprises, as well as bringing in GPs and hospitals appropriately. Now the key thing here in building this capacity is things like, at the bottom of it, a personal health record that you own, such as your Google account or your Facebook account. You can own your personal health record. But it's your personal health record, it's not the NHS personal health record. So there isn't somebody in the NHS saying, I've got this very precious thing, this humongous electronic health record, and I must have level 4 assurance, and everybody must certify to level 4 before you can get a sniff of what's in there. So we're saying, none of that. It's your personal health record. You decide what goes in it. You decide with a consent model which of these people from your social network, your personal network, can have access to the applications that can dip into that store. So it's very much an invert of the thinking, and that's the idea we're pursuing. And lastly, we try to put this in one simple architecture, but this architecture in its layered approach touches on many people with multiple devices using multiple identity and privacy services of the kind you heard, coming to a range of applications, social applications, that can be produced by the gaming type guy or the social enterprise app type guy. It doesn't have to be heavyweights. That can use a common consent model for who's going to get access to those apps and what, in terms of the specific scope of what resource and what actions they can take on things like your personal health record, a care plan expressed as a shared calendar, things like that. So that's the direction we're going. I thought I'd throw it in as this is potentially could drive how we cooperate with industry and how we approach trust frameworks as a starting point. I don't know what the answer is, it's a starting point. And that's mine, because I want to say, here's the starting point, and now Andrew is going to talk about, let's talk about some of the current things that are going on, whether it's level 1 from Google or beyond.
Remove my excuse to swear at Microsoft technology. It actually finally worked. I'm going to talk about trust frameworks in general to get started. Most of you have a reasonable kind of perspective on that, but just get you a little more up to date on the Open Identity Exchange, which is actually the shared group that's actually been producing today. And then to talk a little bit about what Google's actually been looking at from the perspective of how do we actually get started in this space to do something that might actually make sense and try to make some progress. So, take a look at some identity technologies. For all my sins, I must confess that I started with a couple of key infrastructure any number of years ago. I even wrote a book on it. It's made almost no money. You can still buy it. Please, you may be able to ensure that I get more than $1.50 this year if you were to purchase an additional copy. And I worked for RSA Security for quite a number of years in the process of trying to get a set of technology that allowed us to actually make some sense out of identity, particularly in personal space, and you all know what happened there. Not long after that, we came up with this concept in the Liberty Alliance, and the RSA Security company I worked for was one of the first founders, and we said, hey, why don't we come up with this concept called federation, Just basically when we have your identities meet mine and they can do lunch sometime. So we launched a very large and significant set of work in the Liberty Alliance dealing with SAML. We then found that that didn't quite meet all their needs, and the folks on the web said, well, let's do OpenID instead because that's much more lightweight. Found that that didn't quite extend as far as we needed, and then we began to implement some technologies like OAuth and OpenID Connect, as we were talking about earlier today. But the problem is, at the end of it, all we actually know about you is your email address. Not exactly a huge amount of information that we can actually provide as part of this whole process. So I'm an email address. My personal email address is andrew.nash@gmail.com. On Twitter, I'm Winemaker. Not particularly useful or effective. And what's more, I have friends like Preston. Preston is in fact a penguin, in case you didn't recognize him. And Preston, you'll notice, actually has 26 friends and actually is a well-known international traveler, appears all over the world. Please friend Preston. He would really like to have an additional and growing set of friends, particularly in the identity community, and you'll actually see some number of them are actually also participating there. Knowing Preston's Facebook account also doesn't help me very much, because I'm not actually sure who Preston is. Is he me? Is he someone else? Or is he just a figment of our imagination? A number of years ago, while in both the Information Card Foundation and the OpenID Foundation, the White House put out a call and said, hey, we'd really like to have companies like PayPal, who I worked for at the time, and Google, we'd like them to take care of our identity needs because we've recognized basically we can't afford to run it. It's way too complex, and we'd like you guys to do it for us. And so we stood up, along with Google, an OpenID provider and an information card provider at level 1. And so we actually provide the level 1 assurance identities, which would be utilized by the White House in a growing array of opportunities to actually allow citizenry to begin to get access to government services. It's not exactly been the largest uptake of anything I've ever seen in my life today. And it turned out that assurance level 1 was actually the relatively simple part of it. What I did learn that was interesting is that within 3 days of beginning to think about standing up an assurance level 1 identity provider, I came up with this list of questions which began to bother me because I had been in the identity space for at least 20 years and I hadn't thought about the answers to some of these questions. So I asked my friends who were also in the identity community and said things like, well, how many identities should people have? Do we need multiple ones at each identity level? Do we need to hide information? And they came back and said, those are really interesting questions. At which point I said, we're really in trouble if after 3 days I've come up with a set of questions that most people actually think are new and interesting and we haven't thought of the answers for. And this is just at assurance level 1. A whole range of things we learned as part of the PKI experience and various other things is that very large scale anythings, and I was involved in OSI networking for my sins, often don't work. We put in thousands of man years of effort and we don't actually end up using it. And so one of the things we'd actually like to try to do at the moment, as we're beginning to address some of the needs of the US federal government and others, is actually to try to take a look at this from a slightly more pragmatic ground-up kind of perspective, a little more like what we did with OVAC. As part of the work that we did in conjunction with federal government and building these various identity providers, it became clear that we actually needed a much better way to think about these trust frameworks. And both the Information Card Foundation and the OpenID Foundation jointly funded this thing called the Open Identity Exchange. The job of the Open Identity Exchange was to define a trust framework, or in fact many of them, and to provide a place where we could come along and say, hey, as PayPal doing a set of financial transactions for internet commerce, here's what I need the world to look like. As opposed to a FICAM set of definitions that said, largely, unless you're at assurance level 3, we're not interested in seeing you play. So we had this opportunity to come together and define a range of trust frameworks that were potentially applicable and appropriate for a set of use cases and contexts. Because unless you haven't noticed, we will end up in these massive debates where really smart and intelligent people hold completely divergent views and are both right, depending on which particular context and use case you happen to pick on. So in this way, we at least had some way to say, let's narrow this conversation down to something that's interesting so that we can begin to get some agreement and maybe move forward. So the concept of additional trust framework providers and trust frameworks where assessors would come into play, we'd have relying parties and identity service providers that would have some set of rules to interact with. This is basically the concept of what Open Identity Exchange is all about. So when we come to beginning to deal with maybe not quite government level concepts, and in fact anybody that's heard me speak before will know that I can wax long and loud about the inappropriateness of assurance levels and level 2 in particular. One of the things we found in PayPal, for example, was given what the government said was only assurance level 1 identity, we managed to perform billions of dollars of transactions commercially on the internet, and theoretically that shouldn't be possible if the assurance levels are correct. So there was this gap. It turns out there are lots of good reasons why it does work, and risk-based models and smart processing account for some of that. But part of the problem we found was this. As we begin to move forward and try to engage in more interesting kinds of use cases, we found that there is a collection where knowing something about me as a real person turns out to be really interesting. And so part of the question we had was, well, if I was to go up to a media provider and say, look, I'm Andrew Nash, and I have an account over there with a provider, and I'd like to get access to premium content. Their problem was, how do they know that me as a Gmail account ought to be allowed access to that information? So marrying me to who my real-world instance is turned out to be an interesting problem, and one of the collections that we're actually dealing with, and part of what we launched in the context of a set of initial experiments in something called street identity begins to address this. So the challenge here is that there's the me on one side that has to pay taxes, has a set of utility bills, has various privacy and legal protections and instances as a real-world individual legally, has a set of corresponding instances in the digital identity world, but we know a set of different kinds of information, and I can't actually link the two of those together in an effective way. So context here is we'd like to try to be able to connect you up in some way that allows your digital representation and your real-world representation to be linked together if that's what you want to do. So these are use cases where this is a set of context associated with real-world information and your real person. Could we actually pull something together that actually makes some sense out of it? The answer here, as it turns out, is we think it's actually Preston. He's a little short to reach the pedals in most of the cars, but he's making allowances. So this concept is, how do we link your real-world digital identity to the set of digital identities that you're actually known by, where the real you is required? The fundamentals associated with this is we believe that sharing of information has to be permissioned as part of the process. That's non-trivial, it's really hard to do. Eric talked to some of the user experience stuff that we deal with in Google on a regular basis, and we know, based on user testing, just how hard some of this work really is. Particularly if you begin to deal with complex sets of arrangements and begin to ask information or permission to share large sets of information, this is challenging. We wanted to try to provide a system where it was actually affordable, in these cases where it was useful, to be able to link my digital identity to my real-world identity. And affordable and scalable turn out to be really challenging. To address some of that, if we could reuse some set of connectivity that we had made between your digital and real-world identity, then we could begin to amortize the cost of doing some of this. And we would like to, more than anything, build an open ecosystem here. So everything I'm talking about here, in fact, is not generally something that's run by Google. It's actually stuff that we're enabling other people to run, and we're actually asking for participants, both as identity providers and attribute providers, to begin to interact and play with us. And as much as anything else, we're trying to create a model where we can learn some stuff. So much like we did with our assurance level 1 identity providers, what can we actually learn if we actually started exchanging attributes, as opposed to building an architecture that we spent 5 years on where we don't actually do any attribute exchange? So could we begin to share some information in an actual way and build a business model associated with it where people could demonstrate that they could get real value with users' permission out of sharing those attributes in a way that would actually make some sense. So let's talk about street identity. How do you find out about people now? Well, the most common way that you deal with this in general is you generally use one of the large-scale data aggregators, and you pay a large sum of money to get what is primarily a statistical set of indications about the likelihood it's you. They're largely designed around back-end services. They've been around for a long time and have been doing a great job in this space, unless, of course, you're a privacy advocate, in which you have a few issues about the sharing of information, but ignoring that. The challenge here is, if I'm actually a small to medium-sized company, I can't engage with these guys at all. So it's actually not even possible for me to begin to engage with most of them. And even if I could, I probably couldn't afford it. So a large amount of the information that's available that a PayPal could utilize or a financial institution could utilize just turns out not to be accessible. I could do in-person proofing, so I could use something like a post office system, and I've been approached probably by about a dozen different countries in the last 3 months saying, hey, we've got a postal system, we think we can help you with your identity verification process. It's a great concept, except in places like the US, as it turns out. Anyone who's walked into a US postal office knows that the last thing you would be happy to do is actually share any information there that would allow you to be identified. You're actually more worried that a postal worker is likely to go berserk and shoot you on the spot. They are perhaps the most unfriendly storefronts I've ever come across in my life. It's extremely expensive to do in-person proofing. Australia, where I'm from, and the UK actually turn out to be a different kind of environment. Post offices are warm, friendly environments where you're used to paying utility bills, and you might even consider this. It is still expensive, and I do know from my PKI experience that in most countries, we've had several tries at actually trying to make this stuff work in each country, and we actually haven't done so well yet. Working on it, maybe the next iteration using current technology will allow us to get there, but we have some issues. The final way, and there are some others, but the final way I'm going to talk about now is we could actually do something like utilize a much less sexy and very low-tech solution, like we could send you a postcard. How does this work? Well, an example here is in Google Maps, we drive past and we see that, hey, Joe's coffee shop is on that corner. We record it's Joe's coffee shop, and now we have one of these real-world identification problems. How do we know that you're Joe in order to be able to tell us what are the opening hours, or do you've got a patio out the back, or do you also sell wine? Who ought to be allowed to update the information associated with Joe's coffee shop? Well, a low-tech way of doing that is we send you a postcard which has a unique identifier on it. After you log in and say, hey, I'm Joe, we say, all right, we'll see if we can prove that. We send you the postcard, you take the unique identifier, you log back in again, you provide it to us, we say, we're now set, we know that you're Joe. There are lots of problems with this system, not the least of which is it takes about 3 days, there's huge amounts of friction, and it turns out that it's not, in a whole range of ways, the most desirable system on Earth. What turns out to completely blow me away, however, is that unlike public key infrastructure, anybody remember public key infrastructure? We used to say, when we have some legal case law that identifies the use of digital identities, we will be much better off because. Has anybody ever noticed that case law turn up? Anywhere? Any country? Anytime? The interesting thing, at least in the US, about the postal system is we have 200 years of federal law that says we'll beat the crap out of you if you actually try to do anything illegal, like pick up the postcard when it's addressed to Joe. So it turns out there's this whole legal body of precedent around establishing your identity using the post system. So it turns out to be an amazingly low-tech but really effective legal and procedural mechanism for doing this. It's really expensive. It costs us about $12 per transaction in Google to do this. We do about 1 million of these a year in just one of our sections. High overhead. Turns out we're not the only ones silly enough to do this. There's a whole lot of you that run the same process, and most of you are paying in the $8 to $12 range to actually run this process. So you clearly need to do it. There has to be a way to tie to real-world identities for a whole range of use cases. It just is not very useful or acceptable. So one of the things we did was to say, hey, Wouldn't it be interesting if we could actually set up an intermediary, and the particular intermediary we picked was a company called ID DataWeb, and we funded them to say, why don't you go build some infrastructure here as a proof of concept to see whether or not we could actually take the concept of something like an email postcard-based system, and if you could reuse the one-time proofing process associated with that, then the next time somebody comes along and tries to say, hey, I'm a Gmail address, we can look up and say, oh, we've actually verified you're this real person, Andrew Nash, and we could reuse that. Turns out that at scale, we can drive the price from about $12 down to $1.75 almost overnight, and possibly much, much lower than that. All through the magic of amortization and reuse and all of this sort of stuff. If in addition to that we said, well, what if we actually added some other smart attribute providers? What if you actually had a cable provider or a satellite provider or a utility provider? If you could log into them, provide an authentication process, and they could be used for either sourcing or vetting your information, wouldn't that be a much lower overhead process? And it turns out that there are a whole range of people that would like to do that. So telcos, for example, establishing mobile phone numbers or account records. There's a whole collection of people that have been basically chomping at the bit for a whole bunch of time saying, we have this interesting information. If the user gave us permission to utilize this, we think that this would not only be good for the user, but we could make money out of it. And that's not a bad equation to have if you can work out how to make those two things work together. So part of the model that we tested was to say this. If we actually are in the process of utilizing a range of attribute providers, and you were to exchange some claims or attributes, could you get paid for this process? And so that was all part of the proof of concept we stood up with these guys called ID DataWeb. We actually verified that this stuff works. We stood up in October, November in Washington, D.C., held an event to actually say, guys, this is the way the world works. We've got a bunch of people that are interested in this. And so we're actually establishing a set of pilots, perhaps more usefully called science experiments at the moment. We're in the process of beginning to look at how could we actually utilize a brokerage-like system like ID DataWeb, where you sourced many identity providers and many attribute providers. Could we actually exchange some simple pieces of information that would allow us to actually make a difference or make some progress here? And so we've actually stood up a collection of these. We have two, what we're calling attribute provider networks, brokers if you like. One's called ID DataWeb, and a current experiment one's called Trulioo. Trulioo deal with social network validated information, and it may or may not have value. I don't actually need to know whether it does. If there's a set of aligned parties that care about it, then that's not a bad thing. So their job is they go out and they mine or work through your social graph to actually try to establish, are you really who you say you are? And then they would like to provide that to some set of aligned parties. Well, who in their right mind would want to use that? Well, does anybody know who Airbnb is? Airbnb provide a mechanism that allows you to exchange your home with someone else as a short-term rental for a vacation or other purposes. They have no way of vetting who the hell you are. If you could provide them some higher level of confidence that you're a real person, would you be prepared to pay a small amount for that? And that's what the equation looks like. If I can't, as an internet startup, small through medium size, afford to go to a large data aggregator and find out any information, would it be better to know something? So you'll note that this is not being described in terms of levels of assurance. It's being described in terms of, is there a piece of useful information that my user would be prepared to share, and can we set up a reasonable agreement that allows it to be shared so that you can utilize that information for the benefit of the user and the relying party, and somebody could get paid for that. It's actually a really, really simple equation. This is not expecting to say, yes, we know that there are potentially 2,000 to 3,000 identity attributes that you might potentially want to share. Yeah, that's probably true. We figure if we can actually exchange a couple of them, that we may actually have something to build on, particularly in terms of experience, and a way to actually demonstrate that real stuff can come out of this. So, what's with identity? We have this concept of a brokerage. Google does not want to run this. We do not want to own it. We are not even expecting to make any money out of this. If that seems strange to you, harken back to Eric's comment before about why do we do some things. Well, if the internet's made better, safer, more effective, then we win. A lot like Intel trying to work out how to make use of faster processors by generating lots and lots of interesting graphic content. So Google here is not actually expecting to run a broker, and it's not expecting to run an attribute provider. Well, with one minor exception. We actually know stuff like, have you logged in with a second factor authenticator, for example, or a particular class? We could provide that if it made sense, but even that we're not sure if it's worthwhile us doing or not. So in this case, what we're looking at is, can we actually build up a model where we have a set of ecosystem players that own what's going on here that actually allows us to engage in solving some of the problems we've talked about before, amortizing costs and reuse, reducing friction, and trying to get the largest collection of IDPs possible acting as distribution points for this information. The last point I should make here is this. For attributes that are associated with you, not only do you give permission for the use of those attributes, but we actually don't store the information. What we do store is a reference. We say, hey, there's meta information here. I happen to know Eric Sachs' home address, or at least I have a pointer to Eric Sachs' address. If he gives permission for it to be used on your site as a relying party, I'll point you to the authority that can actually give it to you, and you can exchange with them some information and provide some money in order to get access to that information. So Google is desperately trying to step out of the middle of this whole process. We do not want to own all of your information. I know that sounds radical and hard to believe potentially, but we really want to enable other players here, many attribute provider networks and brokers effectively, and many attribute providers as part of this whole system. Okay, so let's take a look at an example of the way that this might work. And actually this user experience has been updated somewhat and is not quite as clunky as it looks here, but this is the starting point. So my user hits a site called UserID TV, and this is a source for all kinds of interesting TV shows and content. If you choose to, you could select an option like logging in with Google as a Gmail provider or any other identity provider they care to support. Of course, what this should look like is actually an account chooser option, which you'll see integrated much more effectively into these contexts. And so Google will pop up here and say, hey, you've logged in here. UserID TV is actually wants to know if they can use some information about you. And so the information we have about you that they're asking about is potentially something like a street address. Is there a street address that you'd be okay sharing with these guys? The reason is you want to get access to some content, and they need to establish that you actually have a premium account that you're already paying for. You say yes, you turn back up at the UserID TV, and they say, hey, you're in, but we noticed that we actually haven't established your subscription status. What we have established is that Google has a home address for you, and it's particularly located with these guys' ID data web. If you elect for me to utilize that as the relying party, then by returning that information, I'll change your subscription status to indicate that you're actually a non-premium content user, and that you should get access to premium content like videos of Eric Sachs talking about the account chooser. It's not exactly a very complex environment, but it turns out that there are a whole range of cases where this turns out to be really, really useful. The opportunity here is for Google users and other identity provider users to get access to a much larger collection and a much richer collection of services if they choose to share information that enables them. So it's all completely still under your choice. You notice that we expect that we have concepts like the ability for you to remove an address, and that through various mechanisms, even at the identity provider, you want to be able to turn off access so that various relying parties can no longer get access to your information. Plus, we expect to have more than a few of them. That's the short version of the concept around street identity. We currently have 3 or 4 attributes that we're looking at the moment, that we're investigating for the pilots that we're kicking off at the moment. In addition to the work that we're doing with pilot schemes, We have actually worked with a whole range of companies. I think we've got about 25 to 30 companies, significant names, Verizon, Visa, a whole range of folks that are actually interested in forming the trust framework that will describe the agreements, the liabilities, the rules by which you'll actually be prepared to play as either a relying party, an identity provider, or an attribute provider in this particular case. These are actually taking place in parallel. We're basically saying, we think we can learn some interesting things in a set of pilots in the near term, while we're actually speccing out some of this stuff, but the pilots ought to feed into the attribute exchange working group and say, hey, these are the 3 most critical things we found during one of the pilots. Please make sure you pay attention to that. And include that as part of the understanding you have about what you're building as an attribute exchange network. I guess we have some of the folks that have actually indicated interest or playing in this space. This is basically the philosophy behind this. Short pause for XKCD people who take this. Anybody that build OSI networks will appreciate just how painfully true this is. So right at the moment we'd like to pass the salt. So we're looking to be in a position where we can pass some salt, work out what it's actually like to use it, rather than designing everything from scratch. Not against that, totally in favor of smart people working out what to do. We'd actually like to do something. Anyone that's been in this space previously, that's been around yet another one of these loops, may be able to relate to that. So where are we? Well, we built the proof of concept. We actually funded ID DataWeb as an external entity. We took no share in them. We basically said, here's some money. Go see if you can actually prove this stuff works. All of the infrastructure and the content that they built up around the APIs and the working models is all available to you at a site called streetidentity.com. It's all open sourced. All of the user experiences, all of the use cases and the context are all available publicly. We do not hold and do not wish to hold any intellectual property in this space. We held an event in DC where we basically showed the stuff actually working, began to talk about some of these same kinds of concepts. We kicked off the Attribute Exchange Working Group in OAX, and we're right in the process right now of establishing a set of agreements around pilots associated with the first phase of actually exchanging some attributes. We have some interesting ones. The supervoter one, for example, is how do you actually prove to a member of government that your email is something they should pay attention to. Turns out in the US, if you don't send them something in a physical envelope, they ignore it. It's considered to be spam. This will let you say, hey, I'm a Gmail user, and by the way, I'm actually your constituent, please pay attention. Turns out that's very interesting. We have a company that deals with all kinds of processing associated with equities, that basically is trying to set up their own secure exchange network for certified document delivery. We are talking to another number of government agencies about citizenry services, particularly some that would like to make some move quickly and actually begin to get some actual experience here. And then we have a whole raft of internet companies that fit into the social graph assertion space, and these are just the beginning. Our current plans or hopes are that we should be able to kick off sometime about middle of April is when we're expecting to get the first phase of pilots running. We expect to take that content, feed it into the Attribute Exchange Working Group, and then somewhere around the second half of this year, take the aggregate of all that and say, what ought the next level of this stuff look like? So having learned what we did, what is the next set of stuff that you as individuals, line parties, governments, etc., what would you like to see us build in as the next level? What's really important? What does the Attribute Exchange Working Group say about the trust framework? And then iterate and actually run the next set of pilots based on that. So, if you'd like to know more, streetidentity.com has a huge collection of information on it right at the moment. It's all free and open. Feel free to use it. We actually have had people take all of the code and build their own attribute provider networks. It took them about 2 weeks. It's almost all of it is based on REST interfaces in conjunction with OAuth. Okay, it's not exactly the most technically difficult infrastructure you will ever see to build. If you wanted to play as a relying party or as an attribute provider, the overhead associated with integration is actually pretty simple.
If you would like to be involved in any of the pilots, either in the first or second phase, please contact me. If you'd like to play in the Attribute Exchange working group, then OIX has a couple of folks that are the chairs of that group, and those are their email addresses. You can use it. And I actually have 8 minutes to spare. Thank you, Phil, for giving me an extra few minutes. I'll take the risk of asking if there are any questions. Oh no, Tony, you're excluded.
No, it seems like it is creating some, I would say, privacy nightmares as far as your attribute providers are concerned, potentially knowing where the attributes are going. So it doesn't seem like it's going to meet the needs of many governments in that respect until there's privacy features built into this.
Yeah, so I think the two answers to that are, firstly, we're expecting to build out a bunch of the privacy requirements in the trust framework model. So we think that those folks will be addressing a set of the privacy enhancements or the next stages that we deal with. In the short term, for the first set of pilots, what we're actually looking at is a whitelisted, very small group that actually come to a set of agreements about what the requirements are for operation. Most of the folks we've talked to think that that's actually a sufficient way to get started in this space. Does this solve all problems? It may not. But that's actually, the aim actually here is to avoid blowing the ocean.
Individuals acquiring those attributes and proof of claim and sharing them using a similar model seems very similar, but not happy to go back to the attribute provider. The attribute provider gives it to the individual with a certificate. Personal data store sort of concept?
You should say that.
Yeah, strange to say that. In case you're not aware, I actually, well, as a PayPal funded as the go to actually go build personal data stores. I expect to spend quite a bit of money on it. I'm not again. I'm totally in favour of personal data stores. Still waiting to see how much progress they're going to make and how they integrate into this model. So it's entirely possible.
One of the challenges is who pays for the attribute provider to run their business and do the cost. The government, if it's the verification, maybe they'll do it for free. But a lot of the, and you get a number of attributes could be, if you're a graduate of Stanford University, if that attribute provider wants money for that, maybe the way to do it, or does require more than to do it, money.
Yeah, personally asserted information, where you don't need an authoritative backing store, it's all kinds of different use cases and models that make sense. We particularly chose a set of cases that we figured would also be useful to Google as a relying party, so that's where we're starting. Anything else? You're free to throw rocks, join the Attribute Exchange working group, you feel free to engage, whatever way it actually makes sense. From engagements with the large-scale data aggregators, that some of whom indicated they would like to be attribute providers in this network, we actually think that we have an interesting opportunity here to begin to see permissions from users utilized in the conjunction of the data aggregators over time. So we actually think that there's an interesting forcing function here that may cause some change in what's a much more complex and gnarly kind of space than what we're dealing with right at the moment. So we think that there's some net good that's going to come out of this network space.
Do you expect the data to be persisted or just be on a runtime basis?
The answer to that is that it lies in the business models and agreements of the particular attribute providers. And so, for example, if I deal with large data aggregators, the answer is you get a one-time use during real time for most stuff. There are other cases where there are attribute providers that might be happy to either have the information cached or reused over time. It again is use case dependent. The fresh information turns out to be a really critical part of this for many use cases where I actually don't want to store the stuff. I actually need to go back to the source to make sure I pick up the latest shipping address, for example, because I like to make sure the stuff gets there each time. And so the answer, there's no one right answer. It depends on the relying party, but in many cases, as it turns out, it's highly dependent on the business model of the attribute provider, and they're very different.
And is the $1.75 you mentioned, is that on a per request for information basis through ID Data Web? Is that your cost through ID Data Web, or was it sort of planned kind of commercial this is what small and medium-sized businesses can expect to pay. They're trying to buy a street identity, a virtual identity.
It's actually what I, as Google, am expected to pay ID data with through a lying party. And so, or you or anyone else, as for that matter. They have the ability to deal with this on an international basis. The price does go up somewhat because international coverage is more expensive. There's a whole range of other subtleties here. They do deal with address delta changes from US Post and a bunch of those sorts of things. So fresh information is available. Yeah. Sorry, all right, so I'm going to hand over to Eric, and he's going to talk about next stages.
Thank you very much. So getting towards the end, myself and one other person will be speaking now about strong authentication. So I talked a little bit earlier about increases in account hijacking that Google and other large webmail providers and social networks do. And then I spent some time discussing that one of the ways that we're trying to deal with it is to convince a lot of websites to get out of the password business and instead let users use identity providers, which basically just puts a bigger target on Maya's, Google's back, and Hotmail's back, and Facebook's back, etc. And we refer to it as the keys to the kingdom problem. Now we have this, even more important account. At the end of the day, 80% of users are using the same password across all of them. We probably haven't really moved the danger point, but at least for a set of sophisticated users, we want to offer them the option to better protect their account. So over the last year and a half, you may have noticed that a whole bunch of companies, Yahoo, Facebook, Google, Windows Live, AOL, PayPal, etc., have started to offer options for users to do multi-factor authentication. Some like PayPal and AOL have been doing it for years. We've all been a bit more aggressive about it recently, especially as we've become identity providers. These mechanisms that almost all of us use rely on the concept of one-time passwords sent to your phone, or an app on your phone generates it and you type it in. The idea of combining something you know with something you have. People in this room realize those techniques are still susceptible to phishing, but there's an improvement in them. We certainly see Google account users who use this stuff see a significantly reduced increase in account hijacking. However, users hate, despise, spit on, or find these options absolutely disgusting. As an example, for a while, when Google was offering this service, the set of users that we would target it at were the people whose accounts had been hijacked. So after your account had been hijacked, you went through some horrible, horrible experience. Maybe you had a lot of your data deleted. We'd say, hey, there's this other thing you could do to protect your account. Wouldn't you like to do that? Not many people would sign up. Of the people who signed up and who had to do it for a few weeks, a lot would turn it off. So the set of people we thought were the best target, still really disliked it. And any of you all who have tried to deploy these types of mechanisms within a corporate environment probably know that your employees hate you for doing this. So we're certainly trying to continue to iterate and make these mechanisms more usable by a wider population. But to be honest, we have better experience right now with sort of risk-based modelings for login systems. So we do continue to try to think a bit out of the box about, okay, even just taking Google, as a company who wants to protect the accounts on behalf of our users, what would be a much more usable form of strong authentication? And there is a particular model that I'm going to walk through right now called the Element OP proposal. This actually came from April of 2001 and overlaps a bit into what has evolved into the Street Identity Project and the Attribute Exchange work group that Andrew was talking about, but also has some pieces that fit into some models for strong authentication that might potentially in the future work better for us, but involve more companies than just Google, so we want to raise awareness about it and try to attract people to join and become parts of it. So, this is just a standard slide deck like that. It's been around for a while, so I'm going to go run through it. The Element OP refers to a set of layers for how identity can work. That local governments, mobile operators, phone numbers, OpenID, and passwords. And let me go through each of these, starting at the top and working my way down. So, passwords are the things we've come to love to hate. We spent a lot of time talking about them earlier. People reuse them everywhere. We wish most sites weren't actually even taking advantage of them, and we're just outsourcing this stuff. And the OpenID Foundation has been trying to standardize and get increased adoption of the concept of identity providers. And if we do, great, then a lot of passwords do go away. And so OpenID does some helpful things there. And we focus on things like certification, like user choice, etc. However, there are two things that OpenID does not specify. One of them, which a lot of people forget, is it doesn't specify how the user is authenticated at all. The second one is it is technically a mapping to a URL, or numerical identifier, certainly not to a real-world identity. So it only gets us so far. Now, interesting thing then, take a look at what's going on with phone numbers. So, I mentioned that Google, Facebook, Yahoo have these optional multi-factor authentication systems people can opt into. But how many of you who are Gmail users have noticed prompts asking you to give us your phone number? All right. How many have not done it yet? Okay, I can pretty much guarantee your account's going to be hijacked within the next few months, statistically. To be honest, when we ask people this, we do get some small set of people, what the hell is Google asking for my phone number for? In the past, all they needed was my email address and my password. What is this possibly good for? It is good for two things. The most common one is if your account is hijacked, and the only thing we previously knew about you was your email and password, in many cases we cannot successfully give you back your account. If we have a phone number from you and your account is hijacked, well then, when your account is hijacked, we can send a one-time code to your phone number as a way of recovering access to it. That's been very successful for us, has helped us get a much larger set of accounts back to people. We get the examples of people calling us just crying on the phone or showing up at Google offices, oh my God, I worked on my dissertation for 3 years and it was just in a Google Doc and I never backed it up anywhere else, and it's all gone. All the photos of my family gone. So it is a method to protect yourself. And if you look around at other major providers like Facebook, Yahoo, Microsoft, you'll notice they all are trying to incent users to provide a phone number mechanism. It's a better recovery mechanism for your account than the secret Q&A type of stuff where everyone's putting all the answers on their Facebook page anyways. The other reason that we ask for those phone numbers is that even if we can't get you to opt into these strict forms of multi-factor authentication, where on every new computer you ask to enter an OTP, we can at least do risk-based modeling that, hey, you've only ever come to Google from this IP address at this time of day, and all of a sudden you're showing up from Tanzania. We're not, maybe we won't let you into your account from there unless you can somehow get an OTP that was sent to your phone, maybe even though the phone is back in the United States. Sometimes we have false positives there. We keep people blocked out of their account. So it's just a gray line, and we try to mix and match, try to find the best way to do it. But interestingly, the use of phone numbers has already, for most of these large identity providers, become their additional form of authentication, either in this weak second factor authentication or in this extremely strict version of it. But there's an interesting point there. As I said, this is not very usable. This is a painful mechanism, and when we go and admit this pain, we frequently get in the rooms with telcos who laugh at us and say, ha ha ha, we could do a much better job with that. And we're like, yes, please, come and help us. The mobile operators already have a much better job of what user owns what phone number. They don't need to deal with things like OTPs. They have device identifiers, SIM cards, etc., that can do a much better job of this type of mapping. And for any of you, for example, deployed like enterprise BlackBerry devices, they're using very strong forms of digital certificates to map devices to accounts. Users never even need to password. Fantastic. They believe they can help, and they can for some amount of money per user per year. And that's been the problem as we've talked with them for the last few years, that they do think they can improve the usability of strong authentication. They do believe they can improve the adoption of it, but there needs to be something in it for them to offer this as a service. And to be honest, the amount of money they want is larger than, say, even Google could pay for all of our users. Frequently amounts like $10 per user per year are talked about. I got 2 billion users. That's a lot more complicated. Maybe they'll be all of it. Yes. So I'm going to come back to that.
You said you're talking to the wrong telco.
Yes, I know, right? And I'm going to come back to that, like, toward the end, and our next presentation will. So then the next interesting thing we got to is, okay, local governments, because one of the things that mobile operators are really good at doing is account recovery, where, say, you lost your phone. Because one of the common things you can do is go into any Verizon store, BT store, T-Mobile store, etc., show usually a local government-issued ID, who you are, and they will issue a new SIM card for your account, issue a new phone, etc. So even if your phone number was stolen, they have a account recovery mechanism with in-person proofing. That is a pretty big barrier for taking over a lot of accounts. Google does not have that. Facebook does not have that. We have no plans to do that. Maybe Apple with their Apple stores or someday get there. So in theory, if most websites are relying on identity providers to log users in, and identity providers are relying on phone numbers which are provided by the mobile providers, the mobile providers are relying on local government IDs. It's sort of turtles all the way down. So government that in theory that would imply that our government should issue electronic IDs to all of us and we'll be done. I think we've tried that and it hasn't worked that well. And in fact, a couple of countries like the United States have very explicitly said they're not going to offer that as a service to their citizens. So the INSTIC program, that was basically the biggest element of their announcement last year that Obama signed, which is them saying this is not a role that the government is going to play. We need businesses to get involved in this space. So this sort of stack development OP, gets us, farther along in improving the identity infrastructure, but it leaves us some holes. The first, like I say, OpenID maps are virtual identities, not real-world identities. The mobile operators feel they can help, but no economic incentive for them. And the third is that there's a role that the governments could be asked to play, but they are not. So now I'm going to go back a bit towards Andrew's presentation from a slightly different perspective and talk about, okay, what is a form of street identity that has been around for a long time? We have streetidentity.com, which is a website for the electronic version, but the low-tech version was the postal card that we talked about. Now, health systems in the U.S. work differently than a lot of other countries. I'm going to use a hospital as an example, but the same thing could work for a bank, utility company, et cetera. For example, almost any business that's trying to switch to e-billing as opposed to postal mail. But I'll just use the common example in the U.S. of going to a hospital. You go in, you maybe had some heart problems, you went to a hospital when you're traveling, and then you go back home and, darn, you'd like to get access to your medical records from there so you can get them to your doctor, or you'd like to have your own copy. Now in the United States, quite a few of these hospitals, you can actually go to and get access to your healthcare records online. And the traditional way that you do it is you go to the website, you register, you create a username, you create a password, you type in your self-asserted address, they see if that matches their billing system, and if so, they say, great, we will, at the cost to them of $10 to $12 per user, send you a postcard with a one-time code. If in a couple of days later you receive that, you come back to their site, you log in with your username, password again. If you type that code, great, they will let you in, and they will let you see information to the level of we've determined you have AIDS. That is considered legally acceptable as a way of doing this stuff to get your medications, et cetera. As we talked about, there's enough legal and trust frameworks here that people are comfortable with it. But users have to repeat this process at every hospital where they want to get in and access their records, or every bank, or every utility vendor, or Social Security or tax system who historically they've only interacted with in person or in the mail. So the other model, as Andrew was walking through, is what if Frank, like in Andrew's example, went to this user ID TV site. What if Frank goes to the Stanford Hospital website? When he goes to log in, he chooses an identity provider. His identity provider gets the user's consent to release some additional information to the site, not just his email address, but the source of his verified information, which might include name, address, mobile phone number. And it could have been verified by multiple sources, including the user's mobile provider themselves. Assuming that actually happens, under the hood, one of the models involves the hospital getting a OAuth token of a certain type that it can take to the attribute provider. Again, there is a billing relationship there, so there is some linkability, but that's what drives the economic model. And at the end of the day, Stanford Hospital is able to verify, oh, in fact, this user with just 2 or 3 clicks is Frank who lives at this address that matches the billing record for which these records exist. Great, I will show them to the user. That's the type of model that we're getting constant requests for at Google. And we spent a good portion of 2011 sort of evaluating what the market interest in this was. The government space was sort of the easy one, but sort of the hardest requirements. But we saw a much larger set of requirements that honestly came from almost any vendor who has ever sent you a letter in the mail that says, please switch to e-billing and be good for the environment. Not like they're really trying to be good for the environment. They just want to reduce their cost of paying for stamps, right? And almost everyone who fits in that category is interested in using models like this to get a higher percentage of people switched over because there's such a high drop-off rate for doing this type of verification themselves. So all of a sudden we have an approach here that potentially can do 3 things. Now you're using OpenID not just to map to a virtual identity, but also to a real-world identity. All of a sudden now there's an economic incentives for attribute providers where the numbers are pretty large. You look at every potential relying party that needs to verify these attributes. multiply it times $1.75, per user per year, that's an interesting amount of money. And it doesn't, require going behind the user's back to some data aggregator to get that information. And interestingly, while it doesn't involve the government issuing electronic IDs, one of the things that they have said is they're interested in being early adopters of this type of stuff and maybe helping bootstrap some of the economics of it. So Andrew showed how we've made progress on at least the attribute elements of the user, like the street address. And we've talked about earlier about how we're making some progress with identity providers, with user experience, etc. But I just wanted to take a little bit to dive down into the user authentication piece, and then some folks from T-Labs are going to come up and talk about some efforts that they have, a little bit overlapping. So for those of you who haven't tried the Google two-step verification, this is the type of page that a user sees. They go to a new computer for the first time, they type their email address, they type their password, and they see the screen saying, please enter this code that you're supposed to use. So I'm going to make fun of my boss, Andrew. So Andrew comes and joins Google. He's an incredible expert in all of this technology, and Google tells him, you have to use two-factor authentication for yourself, and please make sure to have this app installed on your phone with these backup codes so you can see your data. So what does he do 2 weeks later? He goes to Australia to see his family. And then he tries to log into Google. And what happens? He doesn't have an OTP generator with him. He doesn't have any printed codes. This happens to a lot of our sophisticated technical employees at Google, including our security team, including me. I'll have to admit, I came here and I forgot to bring my phone with my OTP generator. I got really lucky. I had accidentally left it in my backpack, which I only came across by default. If I hadn't done it, I don't know how I would have done all these demos. So if you can't get us to remember this type of stuff, in these situations, how can we possibly train the average user? So instead, what we're trying to look to is a model where if the street identity model, as I said, that is a stepping stone, just to pass the salt part, if we can make that successful, where relying parties are paying to get access to an attribute about a user, like their street address, like for $1.75 per user, would some websites be willing to pay additional money to call an attribute provider who would assert in a trustworthy manner this user was strongly authenticated on that device? And what we found is a lot of websites are willing to do that because it fits in their risk modeling systems. They know what their alternatives are, so they can go in their risk models, see how much they're willing to pay. Others, to be honest, have a hard time making the economics work, but are just required for regulatory purposes to do it anyways. It's easy to require other people to spend other people's money. So there is an economic model we could pursue here to have not just attribute providers of information about you, but attribute providers providing attributes about your session's integrity, how strongly it was authenticated. And so we've gone out to see, who could potentially get in this business. One is the consumer identity providers who are not too successfully getting users to opt into two-step verification, but some of the users are. But it's also attracting other companies, startups, mobile carriers, etc. Now, the mobile carriers are one in particular that we have focused on, and there's a model that we've been experimenting with Google and some of the carriers, which is something closer to an Amazon Kindle. So how many people have ever bought an Amazon Kindle? Wow, okay, not that geeky an audience, so okay, I'm so disappointed. How many of you have bought one of them recently enough that when you open it from the box at home and you open it up, it already knew who you were? Right, so 4 people in the room. So during the process of actually buying an Amazon Kindle, you are logged into your account, and Amazon keeps track of what Amazon Kindle they sent you for that account, and when it turns on, it uses the device ID to come back to Amazon, get access to your account, and bind the device too. So there's no typing email address, there's no password, therefore nothing to be phished. The question is, could we do something similar in the consumer space using your mobile carrier? So one of the models is, imagine you are a Gmail user, you go and buy your iPhone or Android phone, and you walk into one of BT stores, Verizon stores, or you do it online. But during the process, which involves a lot of paperwork and all, one of the steps was you could optionally choose to bind your mobile account to your Google account. And if so doing, you go through one of these traditional OAuth flows where Google would ask the user, hey, are you willing for this company to help you log into new devices? You make that decision, you say yes, you go away. Sometime later, the mobile phone is handed to you or shipped to you. You take it out of the box, you turn the darn thing on, and as far as you can tell, you're already logged into the device. Maybe it asks you for an unlocking code on the device. You do that. You see your email information, your calendar. You open your web browser. You notice you're immediately signed in there. You go and visit some relying party website. You see an account chooser, an ask our button. Click your Google account. does the same OpenID Connect technology we're talking about, but also one of the things that happens behind the scenes is that RP site asks for permission to find out an attribute of how strongly were you authenticated. But that request doesn't go to Google, it goes to a mobile carrier who says, yes, in fact, this session on this device was authenticated at this level, and therefore I, as the carrier, am going to charge you money for giving you that information. So we've been trying to figure out, what are the different attack vectors and usability factors for this. One of the main ones we find is, there are a set of people who are uncomfortable with the mobile carrier having the ability to log completely into their account. What if there was an evil person at the mobile carrier? So technically wise, we split it into sort of two pieces. The carrier gets what we call a demigod OAuth token to your account, meaning it has almost complete access to your entire account, but it needs to be combined with some second factor of authentication of user knowledge, such as a PIN code, a password, etc. And the combination of that, plus whatever mechanism the carrier uses, certificate, SIM card, etc., that then can be used to get a full OAuth token to your Google account that will sit on your phone, as all Android phones have today. Technically, we already, on Android phones and recently on iPhones, have the ability to cause your browser to be logged into the Google account associated with that OAuth token. And once you're there, you can start logging into reliant parties with it. And we basically keep this cookie trail that goes through the different elements of those systems to keep track of how you were authenticated in the first place and who was your attribute provider who did it. So eventually, when you do go to the tax website or the healthcare website that wants to know you're strongly authenticated, part of the ID token that we talked about in OpenID Connect is actually a pointer to who, for that session at the beginning, strongly authenticated. So like I say, that is the model that we are starting to play with, trying to figure out what technology we have to build on Google's side. To be honest, as far as we can tell, there's not a lot of additional technology for us to build on Google's side. This is mostly an opportunity for people who can do a good job of strong authentication. So today we talked about a number of sort of layers of the identity stack that we're trying to build to head in this type of indirection. We talked about OAuth on the bottom as sort of our lingua franca for REST API. OpenID Connect is layer on top, layer Ligand, things like the countries that improve the UX. And then while we're trying to get to multi-factor authentication, we expect we're going to have a lot more adoption through economic models that will incent this, such as the use of attribute providers and eventually mobile strong authentication. So those are the slides that I had. I'm going to answer questions for a few minutes. And I'm looking around. Where's our last speaker? Where's he go? Oh, there he is. Okay. If you want to come up and swap computers with me while I'm answering questions. And we did have wireless mics here, but I think those have walked out. But it's a smaller room. Are there any questions that I can answer for people about that particular element of the proposal, or should we head it off and go? Yeah.
Yeah, question. From the challenge response mechanism. I know Google also do challenge response for build. On your account after AdWords or
Right.
Was there any consideration using a kind of
For identity verification? Yes, part of it is, to be honest, as Andrew was saying, we're not sure that Google is the right company to be a business attribute provider as well as identity provider. To be honest, we don't have enough arrows in our back as you might find other people in that space. Also, what we've actually found is there are a lot of legal restrictions on reuse of verified attributes. So even if we as Google can learn, oh yes, it's that person who owns that bank account, our ability as Google to provide that information to another company is usually contractually restricted by how we did the verification in the first place. Similarly, a lot of companies who work and do like knowledge-based authentication with some of the large data warehouses might find that, oh yeah, I verified that data for my users. I'd love to be an attribute provider here and make money off it. You go and look at your contracts, you're probably going to find you're not actually allowed to do it. So it actually restricts the set of companies who really could potentially be an attribute provider for legal reasons as opposed to cost or user experience.
So I would say that potentially there is a goal for that to provide a developer challenge response.
Yep. Especially if they can navigate the legal order and be allowed to resell that information.
Resell the information or resell the assertion?
I think it is being a mix of both in some of these cases, but probably to depend on the specific attributes. And, you know, we all like to use the example of the over 18 as opposed to your actual birth dates, you know, one being the derivative of the other. But for example, your street address, I think it's both. And we gave the example of proving that you're a citizen in a city, you know, what country. Again, that derivative example might be sufficient. But I think we're going to see examples where we have to do
Great, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Yeah. Hi, my name is Ingo from Deutsche Telekom Laboratories. And first, I'd like to thank Eric for giving me the opportunity to introduce our project here. Deutsche Telekom Laboratories are the R&D unit of the, maybe you know, some of you know this telecommunication provider in Germany, and we are a joint institute with the Technical University of Berlin. And yeah, we try to set up, we want to set up a project that deals with assets or things we think that are useful for the internet. So we are convinced that we can provide things like network authentication or some certain attributes to service providers like Google or other players in that field. And you can see this is the classic way you have mostly today. Every company, from Orange, from Telecom or BT, they all have their own way and own APIs to provide things, to provide network authentication, for example, to the internet. And yeah, if you talk to big players like Facebook, Google, and it's hard for them to implement a lot of different, you know, for every country a lot of different interfaces. And so the first approach was to say, okay, let's have the one common interface. And it was in February 2011, I guess. It was at the Mobile World Congress. We showed a demo where we had one single interface with 6 players behind. It was Software Telecom, AT&T, Deutsche Telekom, Vodafone, and they provided some identity APIs to some exemplary services. But on the long run, we see that this model is not really scaling because we have a bottleneck effect, and we had all the discussion in terms of what is maybe WEC is as one single club of telcos is maybe not enough, or the discussion is a bit open. What we have as a vision is that that instead of having one single interface, is that the telco industry or the club of telcos should have a common and agreed way to interact with service providers, and on the one hand side to providing the asset, and on the other hand to have common instruments like, for example, WEC to take care of the developer community, for example. So then we had this demo where that they provided. It was a demo that was a pizza service, and so as soon as we wanted just we wanted to demonstrate just a few clicks to order pizza without typing a lot of things in your small mobile device. And so we provided the form for the user was pre-filled with name and address and something like that, and the user could control it and say, okay, that's right, or no, I'm in another place, so to deliver the pizza to this place. and even network authentication was used behind, so no password typing. And yeah, this was quite successful, but yeah, web unfortunately is rather, not unfortunately, the nature is more operational, and they have not much resources for doing R&D and topics that are beyond. So we are thinking about, okay, for what can we use our these kinds of assets, these attributes, even for other use cases. And so the idea was born that let's set up a project that's dealing with a certain amount of topics and ask other telcos and service providers and other interest parties to join. These are our main, let's say, main topics. One is telco authentication. Telco authentication means, in fact, the reuse of the network authentication in terms of, on one hand side, we call it zero log, sometimes zero login or seamless authentication. It means that instead of typing username, password, mostly your device already knows who you are. So because you are authenticated against the network with a SIM card or with other network authentication manners. And next thing is a strong authentication. So how can we use these kind of third authentication to strengthen the level of assurance here? And yeah, the third bullet point is let's have a look at network or telco authentication in terms of using the mobile device as an authentication tool in, we call it split device scenarios. So you are sitting in front of your PC or of your set-top box, and you want to download some expensive or not expensive movie or something, and you just say, okay, you use your mobile phone and this split device scenario for authentication. And just to mention one of the possible use cases. Another point is another big issue is telco attributes. So what are the standard attributes we have, what we can offer, and how do we get these attributes in a privacy ensured way, with the user consent to the services. And last but not least, when we talk today about trust frameworks, trust frameworks in a broad case. So many different telcos, even in one country, what are the preconditions when they provide certain kind of attributes to or authentication to service provider. So yeah, you can. It's just for reading here. I'm going a bit more into detail, but in fact, this is what I said before. And yeah, so trust frameworks. Here, what I want to mention is we do not want to reinvent something really new. We want to have a look at the OIX. We want to have a look at the IEF and things that are already there, and try to reuse things and to profile them to build up a set where we say, okay, this is something that we need for our use cases. And yeah, it's a plan. In scope is the scope of the project it's a pure R&D project. So this means we do not set up a real service, or we do not build up a new standardization organization. If we develop something and we have the feeling, okay, this is something someone should take care of, we leverage to these things to already existing standardization, like for example in terms of trust frameworks or so on. Yeah. Then okay, this is just one of the last slides for the benefits who's benefiting from this cross-operator effort? We think that if you have one for all telcos, and it's for the service providers, it's a rather easy task of integration. You get a broad customer base, or a broader customer base. You get in a secure and open. Again, open means not in terms of there are, it's more like, open source is something you see. There's no hidden traps in it. And yeah, convenient IAM solution, because we should not underestimate this factor for the possibility of seamlessness in authentication, because sometimes that username password paradigm destroys the user flow. Then on the central, I call it club of thoughts, because web is just one example. Here you can integrate even central services like bidding or things like that. For the user, it should be convenient to use telco authentication or even some kind of attributes. You have secure, or we want to provide even security and privacy and sure things. And on the one hand side, the regulation, especially telcos in Europe, they're under regulation quite hard, and so the authorities have a special eye on things what the telcos is doing there. So, and this sometimes, could be an advantage in terms of, okay, we provide something that is even under regulation, and the authorities have an eye on it. And last but not least, for the telco operators, it makes sense because of to increase usage and convenience, and to sell supplementary services like bill payment and billing things. You can add services like when you buy something, for example, a video, you can set this to your telephone bill, and providing a better personalized service at all. That's the reasoning behind it. Okay, what's happened? Currently, we compiled this proposal, and we circulated it among different companies. Next, we meet with interested parties. We meet in Berlin for a planning meeting. So everything what sounds here still where we might think, okay, this topic or this issue is still a bit fluffy. It leaves room for, if you say, okay, and come up and says, okay, I want to help, even I want to take part in the telco trust framework thing, but I want to have a look at some business aspects here. So this leaves room for the partners to say, okay, I want to bring in at least one or two additional topics that fit in one of the three bullet points. So, and in Berlin, we want to discuss the deliverables, timelines, and so on. We want to plan the meeting in more, the project in more detail. Yeah, then each participating company chooses whether they want to participate in one or all topics or two of them. So you are not obliged to take part in all of the streams, but you're welcome to. So then okay, you have to write down it, and you have to do okay, who brings what and what, how do we handle IPRs, etc. Yeah, and then we can hopefully start in the middle of this year. May might be a bit ambitious because this legal stuff, but hopefully, we have started from the middle of the year. We have a project about 12 months, I guess, And we had talks already with this company, so we have Telecom Italia, Orange, Portugal Telecom, Telenor, AT&T. We have also talks with AT&T, NTT, Docomo, and Telefonica in terms of O2. And yeah, I'd like to encourage you, if you're a service provider or if you are a telco, just drop me a mail, and if you are interested, and yeah, then hopefully I see you, or I'd like to welcome you in Berlin, and if you cannot show up there in person, we have a bridge, a phone bridge to put that in, and yeah. So any questions or remarks? Yeah.
You mentioned that you were heavily regulated, and especially in Germany. And you gave us outside
of what attributes exactly? I think that if we regulate it in the sense of the distributed, in Germany, as far as you ask the user, if you have a user consent, you are quite free to, as far as I know, to deliver any kind of attribute. But I think, and what kind of attributes? I guess that this is quite much the same we had this morning in the talk of Mike, the address, the home address, because in Germany, well, I guess it's in most of the other countries, if you do make a contract, mobile contract, you have to show your passport or your ID card nowadays, and so this is something we have. This is an attribute, a strong attribute we have of the user. He allows it. We are happy to provide this. But to be honest, there are some. After some years, this attribute might not be true anymore. Because if you keep your contract and you get your bill via email and you move flags, so nobody recognizes, and you have still this old address in there. But this is another story. So you need mechanisms to block it.
Regarding to regulation, I think as long as this project is restricted to research, what we try to emphasize, and secondly, as long as we are open, so every telco can join. This is not a secret club. We don't have many problems. So we have in the past collaboration with other telcos in Europe, where we set up a project with the biggest five telcos in Europe, and then after some while we decided for the regulators told us it's better to make it public and to go to the GSMA and publish everything there. So I think as long as we are open and public about this whole effort, we don't have a problem. Maybe later.
The experience varies in the US. The other wrinkle here is it turns out in some cases even the ones that don't think they can provide content may be able to take a talk to the phone number, for example, and actually give you a verification.
Certainly in previous examples, we've had proxies in Germany for dealing with citizenship data that's been disclosed outside German borders. You have a proxy that provides a authority to make a decision in Germany, not make a decision outside. The data doesn't get passed. Your company and Nokia Siemens Network and Deutsche Telekom are also working on systems. Are working in the TM forum on authentication set of standards, which will then work to support the device interoperability, particularly within the mobile network. because the sharing of devices between networks is that authentication fabric doesn't exist yet properly.
Yeah.
And so therefore, to take this forward for real operation in the future makes assumptions about the mutual authentication in the networks underneath. So is your work linked to that work?
In fact, we have contact with these guys that are sitting in the telemanagement forum, the TMN. Yeah. And a lot of these topics, what I talk about, these SIM-based authentication things, there are a lot of open issues. But this is something we have to talk about and to address and to say, okay, this device manufacturer, this is something we expect from you that you should, although these standards they are not implemented, then for example.
But to know at this stage in your project if you're talking to each other is helpful because it's
Yeah.
So there's a second part of it, which is there's device authentication activity for endpoints taking place, including mobile phones. There's one set between Orange and Ericsson in Kantara.
Yeah.
Another activity in Nokia, and the main one is Trusted Platform Module. You take TPM beyond the Intel AMD environment and take it into the device space, where it would act as a second or third point of authentication against the human authentication, the personal authentication in the device. Is what seems to be happening. That's the road we're going down. So does TPM, Trusted Platform Module, which features heavily in Windows 8 and is already on a lot of existing laptop environments, do you see that featuring in your program?
Actually, I know that there is a lot of discussion going on around TPM, and it's not in the main books, but I think we cannot go on without having a look at it. So this is a rather, or this is what I consider. It's not a research project like an EU project, where you have a lot of different things. We want to run a rather focused thing, but TPM is definitely is something that a bit how to say, SIM card and TPM, so you have a kind of or overlapping things here. So we will have to have a look at it, but focuses on network authentication and what can we do.
Does any aspect of your work take into account location-based data being derived from phone location?
Maybe on the attribute part. It is not that, as I said before, it's still a bit fluffy where we say, okay, this is attribute, let's have a look, what can we deliver? And that is a valuable attribute where a lot of service providers are interested in, and or are rather most of the service provider use GPS anyway or other kind of data, so maybe there's no really interest in it. Then there are other attributes that are more worth it.
But Telecom is actually providing this information if you sign a contract and the user consents to give this information away. So there's even open for everybody service in a platform in our developer platform called Developer Garden, where you can sign into service that provides you this data from our telco network. So you're not getting the GPS data from the phone, but the network location, tower location, or as good as it gets. And what we are looking here for is some interoperable way to provide this data. Currently it's proprietary, you can get the data, but it's a proprietary API and proprietary formats, data formats. So nobody is really requesting this from us. And I think one way to get more adoption for these services is to provide them in a standardized way. So if we go to some bank and say, well, it would be much safer if your customers could opt in to say, well, I'm only using my online banking from inside Germany. This would be some restriction that would affect from Korea or somewhere much harder to much harder. But if the bank has different interfaces to each telco, then this is not going to fly. Besides botnets, we have infected PCs at Germany too, so
it is a critical standard, right? I would agree entirely. It is a critical standard. Location-based interoperability is a huge gap.
And be a very powerful authentication.
We're doing it now in the States. From a Verizon point of view, what we ended up doing was recently putting out a new policy that said opt-in or opt-out to us using your information, your location, just for demographic research or demographic marketing, location-based marketing. We're not selling you anything. We're selling the data about where you are. So it's being done. I mean, it's happening. I'm not suggesting it's the right thing. I think the missing gap, the gap is what control do we now give the consumer to make sure they can turn it off at any point. But I think the location-based authentication, if we could have a standard that would allow us to push that assertion for risk-based transactions, be huge.
There's so many different ways that can be used to physically verify someone at a location at a given point in time.
Yeah.
And interact with telephony concurrently. There's lots of stuff goes on there.
Thank you. Any closing comments or questions or follow-ups?
All right. Very good. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us, I wanted to thank our hosts, Microsoft, for providing facilities, Google for providing lunch, I think, and snacks. And most importantly, I wanted to thank all of you for attending and contributing to this event. As I said, it's one of a series. Next will be in association with the EIC conference in Munich, followed by one in Mountain View, California. So we hope to be back in the UK and EU later in the year, and we hope to see all of you again and have many of you standing up here and sharing your information with us. So thanks again, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah,